morning. I'm so excited. I am Keisha Zulo, founder of the Women in Business Summit, and I cannot wait for this conversation with Kate Farrar, who's a gender equity advocate. Welcome, Kate, to this conversation.
Thank you.
This is awesome. So just a little bit about Kate. She is, like I said, a gender equity advocate. She's former executive director of the Connecticut Education and Legal Fund, WELS. She's a current candidate for state representative in the 20th district. That's West Hartford, if you're in the Connecticut area. She volunteers her time for the Aurora Foundation for Women and Girls, and she's on the board of the Betty Knox Foundation. So I am so excited because you are also a featured speaker at the 15th Annual Women in Business Summit. You're on our executive roundtable. And let's start with just how you're doing. How are you doing with COVID, personally and professionally? So let's tell everyone how you're doing.
Thanks, Keisha. Well, thank you for chatting with me today. And I appreciate the question because I think it's the most important one we all have to be asking each other. And I am doing well. I feel, very grateful at this point that, I'm healthy and safe. My family is healthy and safe. Professionally, it's certainly been a whirlwind. I just ended my job of 4 years as being executive director of the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund. And our sector is certainly in a whirlwind, like all sectors right now. And so that was certainly, it's been a challenging time, and also running a campaign in the time of COVID means very different strategies and approaches. And so that has been a bit of a whirlwind and roller coaster as well. But personally, I just feel like I'm missing hugs. I'm definitely a hugger. I'm definitely missing hugs in my life. My husband is here and my sister-in-law is with us too. So we have a bit of a kind of a changed family structure here and just making sure that everyone is healthy and safe and that we're taking care of one another.
Yes, that is definitely the priority. So you spent 20 plus years in the nonprofit sector. I want to talk a little bit about, some of the challenges you experienced as a female executive or just coming up through the ranks, because a lot of our, folks who attend the summit and just women in general, I love to share examples of how are you able to manage through some of those challenges, because someone may be experiencing that as well. So can you talk a little bit about some of your challenges?
Sure. One of the things I would say about the nonprofit sector is that it definitely is dominated by women, but more men, just like the majority of sectors in our world are the senior executives, are the CEOs, especially in larger nonprofits. And therefore, for me personally, kind of being a woman in the sector, I think to me, what I faced, was kind of twofold, which women can, I think, relate to in any sector. One, I think, is certainly biases and stereotypes of how we use our voice and how we're perceived in any room that we're in. And that was something certainly that I had to face and continue to face as a woman in a decision-making role, and a woman in policy-making decisions, and really making sure that those around the table are hearing you and hearing what you have to contribute, I think is always a challenge, as women we have to overcome. Secondly, I think particularly in the nonprofit world, something I became very passionate about, and actually an organization I worked at faced this challenge head on, is around salary negotiation, particularly for women. And for me in the nonprofit sector, it was definitely not something that I personally thought about or was trained on. And I came to not only understand the value of not just negotiating skills, but in really negotiating my salary, luckily early on in my career. And that, I think, really was an advantage for me in the sector, and was something that I was able to share with other women when I was worked at an organization called AUW, because we launched a nationwide program that actually still exists online today called Work Smart, which is salary negotiation for women. But I think to me, those two things of, kind of how you face bias and stereotypes in a room, and addressing being heard, and then how you really, kind of learn and address your skills of negotiation have been really critical for me as a professional.
Yeah, and I think it's really awesome that you said that you learned to negotiate earlier on, because it set the pace for when you would, move to another position. I know exactly the impact of that. So you are a gender equity advocate. What does that mean for you?
Good question. Yeah, this isn't something, I think people have to understand the distinction more and more between equality and equity. And, I certainly didn't come up with this myself, but equality, to kind of make a kind of good comparison, equality often focuses on creating the same starting line for everyone so that there's quote unquote equal opportunity. Whereas equity is about making sure that people have everything they need to get to the same finish line. And that's how you can often distinguish between equality and equity. And ultimately, gender equity, you need to have very comprehensive system-wide approaches to make sure that everyone has what they need to reach, again, kind of those, a sentiment of fairness, quite honestly, in reaching similar goals. And women of color in our world face the greatest disparities when it comes to gender equity because of the intersection between racism and sexism. And that means in our approaches and our solutions, we have to be mindful of that. And it's not kind of an either or scenario. It really is how those real issues in our society intersect.
Awesome. And that leads me into the question perfectly of asking, what recommendations would you have? I mean, I know it's probably some heavy lifting, but what would you recommend governments and, private sector, how can they implement policies that would make things, create that playing field, fair playing field for women?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think we could just have hours and hours and a whole list of those things, especially I would say, Keisha, in this moment of COVID-19, we know women of color are disproportionately impacted, not just in regards to their health, but their economic security. But to me, what has to be the prioritization, whether it's on the government side or the private sector side, is how this forces us to pay attention to the value of caregiving in our world, which women carry the majority of that role. And that means we have to invest in universal pre-K. We have to make sure employers are doing what's possible to provide affordable childcare for their employees. We have to expand healthcare access so it's not just tied to employers. These are big things we have to do so that caregiving is really recognized, and women especially aren't, really carrying the thrust of these effects of COVID.
Yeah, and it's so easy during this time for some of these issues to fall by the wayside because we're so focused on social distancing and every health, just figuring things out and readjusting. So how do you, what policies you think, or how would you encourage organizations to monitor monitor and track their progress so that even in times like COVID or whatever comes up, that these things don't get discounted or forgotten, especially as everyone comes back to work, or, as we readjust to the situation?
Yeah, it's such a great point. I think often, equity goals can feel like they're set aside during times of emergency when they're even more essential in your planning. So for any, private entity, any nonprofit, any government structure, I think you have to, number one, look at your leadership team, make sure that there are women of color, especially a part of that decision making, a part of those feedback processes, because again, you can't make decisions effectively, without women and, especially women of color at the table when they're most affected. So I think you have to look first internally, at yourself and what your leadership team looks like, and make sure that you are taking the time to set what those goals are now. They certainly may have changed. But you need to set some goals so that you're in a learning environment where you are addressing bias and you're continually learning across the organization how to serve those goals moving forward. So it is an adjustment, but it's, I think, a real centering by looking at your leadership team and making sure in your decisions in emergency, but also as you come out of this crisis, that you're not losing sight of the equity lens.
Yeah. And so I was just thinking back through my career in corporate, and a lot of the conversations and decisions that were being made were by people who did not look like me or weren't of my gender. So how do you bring men into the conversation? Because if it's easy to say, well, I'm not focused on that because you're not at the table. So I'm thinking of the men and how they can make sure that they're bringing this point into the conversation, and how can we ask, how can we have them be allies, I guess is my question.
Yeah. Well, I find, any individual, who identifies as male, it's really about having discussions with them about fairness and injustice, just like anyone else. Those are core values that, to me, at the heart of gender equity and how you bring people into the discussion. And biases and stereotypes hurt males as well. Often I'm at schools, talking about how we have greater gender equity strategies. And for instance, in the nursing field, right? I mean, we have more females pursuing that. And there's a lot of stereotypes against males in that field. You could say the same thing for educators. Again, majority female, there's a lot of stereotypes that men have to deal with in that field. And it really helps, I think, to provide a context of fairness and injustice, but it also helps to provide really the data and research behind how essential it is for business success, for business outcomes, to have diverse teams. I mean, we know from research study after research study that you have improved bottom line, you have, employee retention, you have better outcomes, for the public overall when you have those diverse teams. And that's important for men to feel supported, not just around the values of the conversation, but also what the outcomes are going to look like, and that benefits them as well.
Absolutely. And so I want to just get from you, because you're going into a different world now with running for office, and I'm so excited for you. That it's a new journey, and I know it's not part of our prepared questions, but I wanted to just ask you, how do you feel, and what made you decide to run for public office? And how are you managing through all this? Because it's crazy. You had your plans, and then COVID came along and said, "Oh, I have a different plan." So why the decision, and how has it been for you?
Yeah, I think for me personally, and being in my career as a nonprofit advocate for 2 decades now, I've really been someone on the outside, really advocating around issues of equity and fairness. And I've certainly been motivated for many years to get women to run for office. And I finally felt like I needed to take my own advice. And I also felt that from the standpoint of our state, that we really do need not just more women in state office, but also we need new voices, that are really focused on what our working families and women and girls need in our state. And I feel strongly to bring that voice. And in COVID, I started my campaign in January before COVID was even a word in our vocabulary. And so luckily I was able to raise the funds I needed for state public financing very early. I was able to get door knocking back in the snow in February, amazingly. But what it's meant now is for the past 8 weeks, we haven't had in-person voter contact. It has purely been phone calls and me personally volunteering, when able. But I've made over 1,000 phone calls across the district just to make sure people are doing okay. To your original question, it's really about us being there for each other right now. And certainly, like you started at the beginning and just talking about adjustments, I certainly am an extrovert, so it's hard for me to be away from people. But people are seeking connection and support and help, and that's what I'm trying to do, and really hearing from them and making sure that, I'll really be a champion for what they feel like they need coming out of this crisis.
Awesome, Kate. And what has been the most rewarding experience? And you can share from, personal life or professional so far.
Oh my goodness. Well, actually, I was thinking of sharing something very much related to my run, because when I lived in Washington, D.C. for about 10 years, and one of my roles there that I'm extremely proud of is I was able to co-found a program that's still going on, to this day. It's called Elect Her, and it's still the only program in the country that trains collegiate women to run for student government and political office. And I am extremely proud of that program because it really is kind of changing the perspective of collegiate women who often, again, have all of the skills, have all the experience to gain experience in student government, but often we're not pursuing that. And people don't realize that that experience very much often leads to women running for office earlier on in their careers. And that program, has reached thousands and thousands of women domestically and internationally now. And for me, it just feels like a true legacy, to be a part of launching something like that. And for me, it just speaks to, my values of always paying it forward.
Oh, wow. That is incredible. Yeah, that's a huge pat on your back I'm giving you. That is incredible. I love that impact, and that you were able to start something that still lives on and continues to support women in that way. So we've been talking to a lot of our speakers, and we asked them about the self-care question. It's been very interesting, the response. And women are very busy. We have things going on, and especially in this season. How have you been able to focus on, or have you been able to focus on self-care? How do you define it? And what have you been doing to kind of make sure you're taking care of yourself?
I'm very glad you asked this. It's almost a good reminder, right? Like, what are you doing today for self-care? I actually, when I saw this, I actually thought of an incredible woman that I consider quite a mentor, Teresa Younger, who's CEO of the Ms. Foundation, because I appreciate her. I remember about a year ago, she was given an award, and she thoughtfully said, when you have life and you have work, it's always a mess. It's a beautiful mess, but it's always a mess. And I embrace that because, yeah, it's never, this balance or, this perfect scenario of what these things look like in our lives, and especially in COVID. But right now, I think my self-care is probably two things. One is, for me, just even a few days a week, trying to take a nice long walk, outside, no distractions, that gives me a lot of peace and calm. But also I've been really relying on lots of chocolate chips. I just eat them straight from the bag, and it really does the trick. So I think those two things come to mind.
How have you been feeding your extroverted side? Because for me, I'm introverted. People think I'm extroverted, but I'm an introvert, so I am quite fine at food. But how do you feed your extroverted side? Just wants to go out and hug everybody and be around people and get that energy. How do you manage that?
Well, I definitely do feel more connected in being on Zoom. I have to say it is of value to me. But then, just, with my family, being able to even see them from 6 feet away, that is a joyful experience for me. I was over at our neighbors, similarly, 6 feet away, just feeling their energy, even from afar, that definitely helps me. And I'm looking forward. Today, actually, I'm going to go see some friends for some 6 feet distancing interaction. And that kind of is partially filling my extroverted sense of need.
That's awesome. This has been really great, Kate. Thank you for taking the time. I admire the work that you're doing. I'm very excited that we get to have you as one of our speakers. I think in these conversations, I'm loving them because I'm seeing female leaders in various places that I wish I could be everywhere, but it's just reassures me that we're going to be okay. And having you as a gender equity advocate out there fighting for that is really amazing and awesome. And I commend you for doing that work. So thank you so much for your time. Where can our viewers connect with you?
Oh, great question. So definitely, I would say professionally, the best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn. So you can find me, Kate Farrar, on LinkedIn. And then if you're interested in what's going on with our campaign, would love people to follow that. That is on Facebook and Instagram at Kate4CT. And our website for the campaign is kate4ct.com. And would love people to stay in tune with what we have going on and how we're going to win this race here in West Hartford.
Awesome. Thanks again, and take care. Bye, everyone.